All right, let's dive in. We're taking a deep dive today into the science of identity foundation. ESIF for short.
Steph.
Yeah, and we've got a whole mix of sources here. It's really interesting. We've got some legal documents, we've got stories from people who used to be members, and even some news articles.
Wow.
So what we're going to try to do today is kind of look at what it was like for children who grew up in this group.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. I think that really adds another dimension to it, to this deep dive, looking at, not just the organization itself, but the actual lived experiences of the kids who grew up with these teachings.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of teachings, I got to share this right away. It's from a former student, Ian Koviak. He talked about this weird incident that happened at the SIF boarding school. Another student, Siddha Bellord, apparently showed his classmates some pretty unusual substances that were, well, coming from his body. It's kind of a strange story. I know. But it really gives you a sense of...
that's definitely a unique...
Yeah, just how different things were in SIF.
Start to this deep dive.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
I'm intrigued already.
Yeah, me too.
So to understand how this all came to be, I think we need to start with the founder, Chris Butler.
Okay, so Chris Butler, who also went by... Siddha Swarupananda Paramahamsa.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that name.
Yeah, pretty intense name. He didn't just come out of nowhere, He actually came from the Hare Krishna movement, which a lot of people know as ISKCON.
Right, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that Butler didn't really just follow like the standard Hare Krishna doctrine.
Yeah.
He actually kind of challenged the authorities within ISKCON.
Oh, really? So there was some tension there.
Yeah, and it actually led to like a split.
A schism.
A schism, yeah. And a lot of people followed him.
Interesting.
Drawn to, I guess, his charisma and his unique interpretations of the teachings.
So a bit of a rebel in the Hare Krishna world.
I guess you can say that, yeah.
Yeah. And that kind of rebellious spirit seems to have carried over into SIF, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of a theme that we're going to see throughout this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
But before we get too far, I do want to mention that SIF has been labeled a cult by some.
Right.
And there are some pretty serious allegations of financial impropriety.
Yeah.
That we're going to get into later.
Yeah, it's important to be aware of those.
Yeah. But I want to make it clear, we're not taking sides here. You know?
Right.
Our goal is just to present the information. Let you draw your own conclusions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that really jumped out at me was SIF's boarding school system.
Oh, yes.
The Gurukuli.
Gurukuli.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, imagine being a kid and being sent off to one of these schools, often in like far off places.
Like the Philippines.
Like the Philippines, yeah.
Wow.
And you're completely immersed in Butler's teachings. 24/7. Yeah, that's a very intense environment for a child.
It is.
And that's where I think the concerns about indoctrination really come into play.
Right.
Especially when you consider the allegations from former students that the education provided at these Gurukuli schools was subpar.
Yeah, now that's something I don't quite get. Like parents were sending their kids to these schools knowing that they might not be getting a proper education.
It seems that many of these parents were deeply devoted to SIF and truly believed in Butler's teachings.
Okay, so they saw Gurukuli as like this pathway to enlightenment.
Right. They believed it was the best way to ensure their children's spiritual growth.
Okay. Yeah, I get that. But, it still seems like a lot of trust to place in a group, especially when it comes to your kid's future.
It does raise questions about the influence of belief systems and the potential for leaders like Butler to exert significant control over their followers.
Right, and we're going to dive deeper into the parents' perspective later. But it is worth noting that a lot of former students have expressed feelings of resentment and betrayal. They feel like they were denied opportunities because of the education they received, or rather, didn't receive at Gurukuli.
Right. It's like their childhood was sacrificed for something that they may not even believe in anymore.
Exactly. And speaking of, being denied choices, it seems like children in SIF really had very limited options when it came to, well, everything, right?
Yeah. Many former members describe an environment where questioning Butler's teachings was absolutely forbidden.
Really?
Yeah. It was presented as the ultimate truth.
Okay.
And any kind of dissent was met with pretty harsh consequences.
So basically, kids were raised to just accept everything they were told. Without question.
It's like, imagine being told that the world is flat.
Yeah.
And not being allowed to even consider the possibility that it might be round.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and that kind of environment, I mean, think about it. It can be incredibly damaging to a child's development.
Right.
It stifles critical thinking. It discourages individuality.
Yeah.
And it really fosters a sense of dependency on the group and on Butler himself.
Okay, so we've got like this really intense environment, a very charismatic leader who demands obedience, kids who are not really encouraged to think for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So where do things go from there?
Well, that's where we start to see the potential for real manipulation and psychological harm.
Give me an example.
You remember that anecdote you mentioned earlier?
About Siddha Billard.
Yeah, about Siddha Billard showing those substances.
Yeah.
Well, that wasn't just an isolated incident.
Really?
No, former students have described instances where they were made to feel guilty or ashamed for having doubts. They were pressured to conform to the group's expectations, and their emotional needs were often neglected in favor of upholding SIF's ideology.
Yeah,
It was all about maintaining this image of unity and unquestioning faith.
It paints a pretty disturbing picture.
It does, yeah.
Doesn't it? Of what life was like for these kids.
Yeah. Especially when you consider that they were often isolated from the outside world.
Right, like living in this bubble.
Exactly.
Where the rules of normal society just didn't apply.
Yeah, and within that bubble, there was this figure, Joseph Bismark, also known as Japa Das.
Japa Das. Yep.
He was a prominent member of SIF,
right.
And he had some interesting connections, particularly to a company called QNet.
QNet. Now things are getting really complicated, huh?
Yeah, things get a little murky here.
Yeah.
You see, QNet is what's called a multi-level marketing company, or MLM.
MLM. Okay, now some people might be thinking, well, what's wrong with that?
Right.
But imagine a business where your success depends more on who you recruit than what you actually sell.
Yeah, that's the basic idea of an MLM.
Okay, and QNet in particular has faced some pretty serious allegations of being essentially a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, where the people at the top are profiting off the recruitment efforts of those below them.
Okay, so we've got this potentially exploitative business model, and a prominent SIF member is involved.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big red flag, don't you think?
It definitely raises some serious questions about the financial dealings within SIF.
Right.
Were members encouraged or even pressured to participate in QNet?
Yeah.
We're talking about allegations of money laundering and other illicit financial activities. It's a very tangled web.
It is. It's like, trying to untangle a giant knot of financial transactions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've got this potential for indoctrination at the Gurukuli schools, the psychological manipulation, and now this whole QNet situation.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And it raises a really important question. What happens to these kids once they grow up?
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Well, that's where we start to see the long-term consequences of being raised in this kind of restrictive environment. Many former members talk about struggling with trauma, feelings of betrayal, and just real difficulty adapting to life outside of SIF.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like they were thrown into a world they were never prepared for.
Exactly. They might have limited education.
Yeah.
Their social skills were honed within the confines of SIF.
Right.
And their worldview often clashes with mainstream society.
Right.
It's a tough transition.
It is. And we've read some really heartbreaking stories from former members who felt lost and alone, unable to connect with people who hadn't shared their experiences.
Right.
Some even talked about having to relearn basic social skills.
It's almost like they had to start from scratch.
Yeah. So what about the parents? What role did they play in all of this?
Well, I think you can really see how these belief systems become deeply ingrained in family life.
Yeah.
These parents, driven by their faith in SIF and their devotion to Butler's teachings, they made decisions that had a really profound impact on their children.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that these parents, they believed they were doing what was best for their kids.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, of course. But their definition of best was shaped by SIF's ideology.
Right.
Right. They believed that sending their children to Gurukuli, immersing them in Butler's teachings, shielding them from the outside world.
Yeah.
This was the path to, true happiness.
Yeah.
Spiritual fulfillment.
It's a really complicated situation, isn't it?
It is. It's tough. Because, on the one hand, parents have the right to practice their religion.
Absolutely.
And raise their children according to their beliefs.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's this question of whether those beliefs are harming the child's well-being.
Right. And their autonomy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a real ethical dilemma.
It is.
With no easy answers.
Yeah, there are no easy answers here.
No. But it's a conversation we need to have.
Absolutely.
Especially when we're talking about groups that have been accused of isolating members.
Right.
And potentially harming children.
Right. Because at the end of the day, the well-being of the children should be the top priority. Absolutely.
And we've been focusing a lot on the kind of the negative aspects of SIF. But it is important to acknowledge that not everyone who was raised in the group had like a terrible experience. Right?
Yeah, that's an important point.
We did come across some accounts from individuals who spoke fondly of their time in SIF.
Oh, interesting.
And some who even still follow Butler's teachings.
So there is a range of experiences.
There is.
Yeah.
There is. And I think that's important to remember.
Yeah.
We're not trying to paint everyone with the same brush.
Absolutely.
Human experiences are diverse.
Yeah.
They're complex.
Very much so.
And it's totally possible to have positive memories of a group. And even, find value in some aspects of its teachings. While still recognizing that, there might be harmful elements or practices within that group.
It's about nuance, right?
It's about nuance.
Yeah.
It's not
black and white.
Black and white, exactly.
Yeah.
But I do think even those who had positive experiences might still struggle with the legacy of being raised in SEF.
Right.
I mean, they might question their beliefs. They might have trouble forming relationships outside the group.
Yeah.
Or they might experience those lingering feelings of guilt or shame. It's a lifelong process for many.
It can be.
It seems like the impact of this kind of upbringing can be really, really far-reaching.
Yeah. It can have ripple effects that last for years.
Absolutely.
And even decades.
We've been talking about the potential for trauma. But are there any, specific psychological harms that former members have reported?
Yeah. One of the most common is what's often called religious trauma syndrome.
Religious trauma syndrome. Okay. What is that?
Imagine growing up believing that one specific path
Yeah.
is the only way to salvation.
Right.
And then later on in life, you start to question those beliefs.
Oh, I see.
It can be incredibly disorienting and painful.
Yeah, like having the rug pulled out from under you.
Exactly.
Right.
Everything you thought you knew about the world
Yeah.
is suddenly up for debate.
Yeah.
And that can lead to a lot of different problems.
Like what?
Well, anxiety, depression, difficulty trusting others,
Yeah.
and even a sense of, spiritual homelessness.
Oh, wow.
Some former members also struggle with what's called thought reform. Thought reform.
Or mind control.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but break that down for me. What exactly does that mean?
So essentially, it's a process of systematic manipulation
Okay.
that aims to change a person's beliefs, their values,
Yeah.
even their identity. And in the context of SEF,
Yeah.
former members have described things like isolation from outside influences,
Oh, okay.
constant reinforcement of Butler's teachings,
Right.
and the use of guilt and shame to control behavior.
Wow.
It's a way of kind of breaking down a person's sense of self and rebuilding it in the image of the group.
That sounds incredibly insidious. I mean, it's like you're slowly chipping away at someone until they're completely dependent.
What's really scary is that it can be very subtle and gradual.
Yeah, you don't even realize it's happening.
Right. And the effects, they can linger long after someone leaves the group.
Okay, so what can be done? What can be done to help?
Yeah. People who have experienced this kind of trauma.
Well, therapy is absolutely essential.
Therapy.
Okay. And specifically, finding a therapist who specializes in cult recovery or religious trauma.
Got it.
That can be incredibly beneficial.
I bet. I bet.
Support groups can also play a huge role.
Right. Support groups, yeah.
They provide a safe space for former members to connect with others who understand what they've been through.
Right, like a sense of community.
Exactly. Right. It's all about knowing that you're not alone.
Right, validation.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that healing takes time. It's a process, not a quick fix.
It's a journey.
Yeah.
It is. And I'm curious, with all of the potential for harm, why haven't there been more interventions or legal actions taken against SIF?
It's complicated. Proving harm in cases involving belief systems can be really challenging. You know, there's the issue of religious freedom.
Right, yeah.
And often people within these groups,
they're reluctant to come forward.
Right, because they're afraid.
Because of fear of retaliation.
Retaliation, yeah.
Or shame.
Or shame, yeah.
So it's kind of a catch-22.
Right, yeah.
You need people to speak out to expose the potential harm.
Right.
But speaking out can be incredibly risky.
It is.
For the individuals involved.
Yeah, that's why it's so important for those who have left groups like SIF to share their stories when they feel safe to do so.
Absolutely.
Because their experiences can really help raise awareness, provide validation for others who might be struggling, and potentially even lead to like systemic changes that could protect vulnerable individuals.
It's about breaking the silence. Shedding light on these practices that might be happening behind closed doors.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation, what are the key takeaways?
Well, I think the biggest one
is that cults and high control groups, they can exist in many forms, even within seemingly benign spiritual or religious movement.
You have to be really careful.
You do.
You do.
And it's so important to be aware of the red flags.
Like what? What are some of the red flags?
Well, things like charismatic leadership, isolation from outside influences, rigid doctrine, you know, where there's only one right way to believe, and the suppression of dissent.
If you're not allowed to question anything, that's a problem.
That's a huge red flag.
Yeah. And it's about trusting your gut too, right?
Absolutely.
Like if something feels off, if a group is making you uncomfortable or pressuring you to make decisions that don't sit right.
You need to listen to that inner voice. And it's okay to question things. It's okay to seek outside perspectives.
Absolutely.
And to prioritize your own well-being.
Yeah, always put yourself first.
Your well-being is paramount.
Absolutely. And for those who have experienced harm within a group like SIF, remember that you're not alone, okay?
You are not alone.
There are resources available. There are therapists who specialize in cult recovery. There are support groups where you can connect with others who understand your journey. It's a reminder that healing is possible.
It is.
And that finding your voice can be a powerful step towards, reclaiming your life and potentially even helping others.
It's a ripple effect.
It is. It is. Well, we hope this deep dive has been insightful.
I hope so.
And maybe even spark some critical thinking. About, the groups and belief systems we encounter in our lives.
Because we all encounter them.
We do. We do. And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring. To continue questioning. And to continue seeking knowledge.
The journey never ends.
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. Well, we'll pick up this conversation on our next deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
So until then, keep learning, keep thinking critically.
Absolutely.
And take care of yourselves.
Take care.
All right. See you next time.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah, it can really have a long-lasting impact. And we've been talking about trauma, but have there been like specific psychological harms that former members have talked about?
Yeah, so one of the most common things that comes up is something called religious trauma syndrome.
Religious trauma syndrome?
Yeah, it's, well, imagine you grew up believing that one specific path is the only way, right? Like the only way to salvation. And then later in life, you start to question those beliefs.
Right.
It can be really disorienting.
Oh, yeah. It's got to be like, like having the rug pulled out from under you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Everything you thought you knew
is
suddenly called into question. Yeah. And that can lead to a lot of different problems, right?
Like what? What kind of problems?
Well, anxiety, depression.
Right.
Difficulty trusting people.
Makes sense.
Even a sense of, like spiritual homelessness.
Yeah, like you don't know where you belong anymore.
Right, right.
You've lost that anchor.
Exactly. And some former members have also talked about struggling with something called thought reform.
Thought reform.
Yeah, or mind control.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but can you break that down? Like, what does that actually mean?
Sure. So it's basically a process of like systematic manipulation.
Okay.
And the goal is to change a person's beliefs, their values,
right.
even their identity.
Mm.
And in the case of SIF,
Yeah.
former members had described things like being isolated from outside influences.
Okay.
Constantly being, exposed to Butler's teachings, being reinforced.
Like a constant barrage of the same message.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And also the use of guilt and shame to control behavior.
Wow. That's really intense. I mean, it's like you're trying to break down a person and then rebuild them in the image of the group.
Exactly. And it's so insidious because it's often very subtle and gradual.
Right. You might not even realize it's happening.
Right. And the effects can linger long after someone leaves the group.
So even if you manage to get out, you're still dealing with the consequences.
Right. Okay, so what can be done? Like, how can people who have experienced this kind of trauma get help?
Well, therapy is absolutely essential.
Therapy.
And specifically, finding a therapist who specializes in cult recovery or religious trauma, that can be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I bet.
And support groups can also be really valuable.
Yeah, support groups are great. Yeah.
Because they give people a safe space to connect with others who get it.
Right, who understand.
Yeah, right, who've been through similar experiences.
It's that sense of community.
Exactly.
That's so important.
It's all about knowing that you're not alone.
Right. And it's also important to remember that healing, it takes time.
It does.
Right? It's a process.
Yeah, there's no quick fix for this kind of trauma.
It's a journey.
It is.
Yeah. I'm curious, though, with all of the potential for harm here, why haven't there been more interventions or legal actions against SIF?
That's a great question. And it's a complicated one. You see, proving harm in these kinds of cases involving belief systems can be really difficult.
I could see that.
There's the issue of religious freedom.
Right. Yeah.
And often people who are in these groups, they're just reluctant to come forward.
Right, because they're afraid.
They're afraid of, retaliation from the group.
Right.
Or even just the stigma.
The shame.
Yeah, the shame of admitting that they are involved.
So it's kind of a catch-22, right?
Yeah, it is.
Like you need people to speak out to expose the harm, but speaking out is so risky for the individuals involved.
And that's why it's so crucial for those who have left groups like SIF to share their stories when they feel ready and safe to do so.
Right.
Because their experiences can be incredibly powerful. They can raise awareness. They can validate the experiences of others who might be struggling.
Right.
And they can potentially even lead to systemic changes.
Right. To protect other people.
Exactly. It's about breaking the silence and shining a light on these practices that are often hidden from view.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that cults and high control groups, they can take many forms.
Right.
They're not always easy to spot. They can exist even within seemingly benign spiritual movements.
Yeah. You really have to be careful.
You do. And it's so important to be aware of the red flags.
Like, what are some red flags?
Well, things like a charismatic leader, isolation from outside influences, rigid doctrine.
Right, like there's only one right way to believe.
Exactly, and any kind of questioning or dissent is shut down.
You're not allowed to question anything. That's a problem.
That's a huge problem. And it's also about trusting your gut.
Yeah, trusting your instincts.
If something feels wrong, if a group is making you uncomfortable or pressuring you to do things that don't feel right, you need to listen to that.
You do.
And it's okay to walk away.
It's okay to say no.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And for anyone out there who has experienced harm within a group like SIF, remember that you're not alone.
You are not alone.
There are resources available.
There are therapists who specialize in this. There are support groups.
So please reach out for help if you need it.
Don't suffer in silence.
Healing is possible.
It is.
And finding your voice can be such a powerful step
It can.
in reclaiming your life and maybe even helping others.
It's a ripple effect.
It is. It is. Well, we hope this deep dive has been insightful.
I hope so, too.
And maybe it's even sparked some critical thinking about the groups and belief systems that we all encounter in our lives.
Yeah, because we all encounter them.
We do.
Right.
We do. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring.
Yes.
Keep questioning.
Keep learning.
And keep seeking knowledge.
That's the beauty of life.
It is. It is. The journey never ends.
It never does.
It never does.
It really doesn't. It never does.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. So yeah, we've been talking a lot about trauma and the potential for harm, but have there been like specific psychological harms that former members have reported?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most common things that we see is something called religious trauma syndrome.
Religious trauma syndrome. Okay. What is that?
So imagine growing up, believing that one specific path is the only way,
Okay.
The only way to salvation, the only way to truth.
Right.
And then later in life, you start to question those beliefs.
Oh, okay.
It can be incredibly disorienting and really painful.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like you said earlier, having the rug pulled out from under you.
Exactly.
Right.
God.
Everything you thought you knew about the world is suddenly up for debate.
Yeah, and it can lead to a whole bunch of different problems,
Like what?
Well, anxiety, depression, trouble trusting other people.
Right.
Even like a sense of spiritual homelessness.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's really intense.
Yeah. Some former members have also talked about struggling with something called thought reform.
Thought reform.
Yeah, or mind control.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but can you kind of break that down for me? Like, what exactly does that mean?
Sure. So basically, it's a process of systematic manipulation that aims to change a person's their beliefs, their values, even their identity. And in the context of SIF, former members have described things like being isolated from outside influences, having Butler's teachings constantly reinforced, and the use of guilt and shame to control behavior.
Wow, that's pretty heavy stuff.
It is. It is. Yeah. It's really about kind of breaking down a person's sense of self and rebuilding it in the image of the group.
That's incredibly insidious.
It is. And what's really scary is that it can be very subtle.
Right.
It can happen very gradually.
Yeah, you might not even realize it's happening until it's too late.
Right. And the effects, they can linger long after someone leaves the group.
Right. So what can be done? Like, what can be done to help people who have experienced this kind of trauma?
Well, therapy is essential.
Therapy.
And specifically finding a therapist who specializes in cult recovery or religious trauma.
Got it.
That can be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I bet.
Support groups can also play a huge role.
Right, support groups, yeah.
Giving people a safe space to connect with others who really understand what they've been through.
Right, who get it.
Exactly. It's all about knowing that you're not alone in this.
Right, validation, yeah.
Yeah. And it's also important to remember that that healing takes time.
Right.
It's a process, not a quick fix.
It's a journey.
It is.
Yeah. I'm curious though, with all of this potential for harm, why haven't there been more interventions or legal actions taken against SIF?
That's a great question. And it's a complicated one, Proving harm in these kinds of cases that involve belief systems, it can be really difficult.
Right.
There's the issue of religious freedom. And a lot of times the people who are in these groups, they're reluctant to come forward.
Right, because they're afraid.
They're afraid of retaliation from the group or even just the stigma.
The shame.
Yeah, the shame of admitting that they were involved.
Yeah, so it's kind of a catch-22.
It is.
You need people to speak out.
Right.
To expose the harm.
To bring it to light.
Yeah.
But speaking out can be incredibly risky for the individuals involved.
Yeah. That's why it's so important for people who have left groups like SIF to share their stories when they feel safe to do so.
Absolutely.
Because their experiences can be really powerful. They can help raise awareness. They can provide validation for others who might be struggling.
Right.
And they could potentially even lead to, systemic changes.
That could protect vulnerable people.
Exactly. It's about breaking the silence.
Yeah.
Shining a light on these practices that are often hidden.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so as we wrap up this this deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that cults and high control groups, they can take many forms.
Right.
They're not always easy to spot.
Yeah.
They can exist even within seemingly benign spiritual movements or self-help groups.
Yeah, you really have to be careful.
You do.
Yeah.
And it's so important to be aware of the red flags,
Like what? Like what are some red flags?
Well, things like a charismatic leader, isolation from outside influences, a very rigid doctrine, where there's only one right way to believe.
Right.
And the suppression of any kind of dissent or questioning.
Right. If you're not allowed to question anything, that's a problem. That's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And it's also about trusting your gut.
Yeah, trusting your instincts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If something feels wrong, if a group is making you uncomfortable or pressuring you to do things that don't feel right, listen to that.
You do.
Don't ignore those feelings.
It's okay to walk away.
It is. It's okay to say no.
Yeah. Yeah. And for anyone out there who has experienced harm within a group like SIF, just remember, you're not alone.
You're not alone. There are resources out there. There are therapists who specialize in this. There are support groups. Please reach out for help if you need it.
Don't suffer in silence.
Exactly.
Yeah. Healing is possible.
It is possible.
And finding your voice can be such a powerful step in reclaiming your life.
It really can be.
And maybe even helping others.
It's a ripple effect,
It is. It is. Well, we hope this deep dive has been insightful for you.
I hope so, too.
And maybe even sparked some critical thinking about the groups and belief systems that we all encounter in our lives.
Because we all do encounter them.
We do. We do. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep questioning, and to keep seeking knowledge.
The journey never ends.
It never does. It never does. Well, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye.